this meeting is one physical reflection of a much more powerful structural elitist order, which really essentially has an aim of creating a world which is very much dictated to by them. People call it, well, much of mainstream media will poo-poo such suggestions as well as being conspiracy theories. But there is another side to the global one world order. Of course, amongst Muslims in Islam, we talk about the concept of ummah, the idea of ummah being the entire humanity which has to get on with each other. And of course, these concepts are quite often misinterpreted and stereotyped by mainstream media too. I mean, you couldn't tell most Western individuals that the global ummah or one world order was something that they ought to buy into, because immediately they're going to think about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and that franchise, which is inevitably not one of really Muslim or Islamic making, but rather something which we allege is a deep state and a Western deep state endeavor. So lots of issues here. One world orders, is it such a bad thing? I remember hearing a scientist once say that actually we were, as a human species, ready to jump from a zero numbered civilization to a stage one civilization, one in which the internet plays a central role in bringing us together and giving us a common purpose. Well, there are all sorts of ideas. Everybody would love to see a one world humanity that all gets on, but there are different concepts as to who should be in charge of any such emergence, and whether it's even likely is what we're going to debate today. I'm going to start with our investigative journalist making your debut here. Tony, what is I mean, you've worked on the Bilderberg meeting, so let's start there. What is the Bilderberg setup? What is it? What is this phenomenon?
Okay, so I worked for 3 years in London for the BBC on the front line and doing journalism there. And when I came across the Bilderbergers in 1995, I was pretty shocked that I'd not come across it before, because if you look at the list of names of people who were there, and let me just, sort out one of your questions immediately, is the reason that they're not really reported on in any fair way is that they are in the meetings. The senior general manager of News International, as it was then, the Murdoch empire, is in there. Most of the main broadcasters are in there. Even some TV personalities are in those secret meetings. And of course, it's quite clear that if a journalist is going into a secret meeting of the global banking elite, royalty, and the most powerful people in the world, and they are really the richest, maybe not the most powerful, but certainly extremely wealthy, and then they're not reporting it, it's quite clear that they're not on the side of the public. And in fact, their organs, their entire Murdoch empire, I think we can say, is not actually working for the public interest. It's working for its own private interests. And you can see simple facts like the media's repository of massive amounts of its cash in offshore accounts that can't be taxed. They are part of effectively an empire which doesn't want to really contribute to society. It's doing everything it can in order to keep its wealth and to stop the contributions that it should be making. So I think the media being inside the Bilderberg meetings is one really important factor. It must make clear here, we're talking about the NATO countries. Okay, so it's not a global thing. These are the mainly United States, UK, and the European nations. You may find an odd person from another place in the world that's not European and not American or Canadian in there, but certainly no New Zealanders and Australians. This is very focused on the West, and it's very focused on the original NATO countries. Now, NATO is expanding, and as it expands, the odd person from those countries. So effectively, what we're dealing here with is a political lobbying arm of NATO. Key figure at Bilderberg is the one and only Henry Kissinger. He's someone whose power has carried on even since he was Secretary of State in the 1970s under Nixon, and conducting coups in countries like Chile, Indonesia, etc. I mean, he saw himself as a very clever chap who thought he could be doing these coups without anyone realizing. And of course, that back in 2001 in Chile, he was indicted for war crimes, so he can't travel to Chile. There are various places in the world that Kissinger cannot travel to. He's a war criminal with a Nobel Peace Prize. So Kissinger is a very important figure at Bilderberg. And I can remember the last conference I went to, which is in 2016, just before the Brexit vote, over in Dresden in Germany. We were getting rumours outside the conference. It's always worth going to these conferences because outside, as a journalist, you pick up all sorts of interesting gossip from the staff in the Bilderberg Hotel, wherever they're meeting. And this we heard that Ursula von der Leyen was up on the top table on the Saturday evening meal with Henry Kissinger, the pair of them, like king and queen, over the conference. And of course, it's since transpired that she has now taken over the presidency of the European Union. So even back in 2016, there were indications that the Bilderberg was actually involved in one way or another in the path to power of senior, very important politicians like the European president. So that's the main role of it, I think, is basically like a almost like a horse fair. So the politicians come along, then all the powerful media, endorsed by Goldman Sachs, endorsed by these big lobbying organizations, etc., and then they get put fast-tracked to power. And I would also suggest that many of these people have control files on them. So that means that there have been surveillance on them over the years, and any criminal acts that they've taken place will be there in case they need to be blackmailed. And this, I think, is the facade of democracy. And I think it's important to actually get into how it actually works, because for millions of people, it looks like a democratic system. But we're effectively dealing with an international mafia here who only allow their own chosen puppets into positions of power nowadays. I think probably the 1970s, that was different. There were some genuine politicians. Then after a series of assassinations, for example, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, in the 1960s, the bouncing out of Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, by the security services in the 1970s. We've now got, I think, no real choice. And we've seen that here in Britain. We had Jeremy Corbyn as the Labour alternative, the opposition leader, and he was being given a chance to get into power. He was blocked out at every opportunity, and an enormous campaign by his own party, in fact, as it's now been proven. People working for him, paid for by his supporters, were actually actively working to stop him get into power. So there is an enormous effort goes in, I think, by the banksters. Final thing I'll say about Bilderberg is the very clear links that I've dug out and others to the Nazis. And the first chairman of the Bilderberg was actually a Dutch prince, Prince Bernhard, and he was actually an SS officer in the 1930s who was then a spy for the Nazis within the British and the Dutch establishment towards the end of the war. And so to have for its first 20 years a former SS officer as its chairman, I think we can see that the Bilderbergs are very much tied into this hatred of religion, as the Nazis hated the Christians, they hated the Jews. And so that is, I think, effectively a quite clear signal that that's what we're dealing with, a really anti-biblical and anti-moral attempt to control. I mean, Hitler himself was seen as a sort of, he tried to portray himself as a sort of man-god, somebody that everybody would look up to, a savior for Germany, put into that position very cleverly because the bankers deliberately, including the Bank of England, by the way, it cleverly collapsed the German economy. And that's why we have to be very careful about economic collapses, because it can provide a red carpet for dictators like Adolf Hitler, as it did. So the German people embraced him, saying, well, this guy has sorted out the economics, and stupidly went over the line and said, well, he's our savior. As soon as you start saying things like that, then you're getting political leaders straying into the territory of, religious figures like Muhammad or Jesus and Moses. And that, I think, was the reason why he became so successful in his day, a fake religious person, a fake savior. And that's what we've got to be very concerned about today too, I think.
Well, some really stimulating and fascinating points. I'm not going to claim to know a lot about the details, but you've obviously been on the ground following these conferences, watching and analyzing. Maulana Razavi, it's a very unique account that Tony's given us. A few immediate red flags for me are this idea of a world order run by immoral bankers, immoral, if you like, folk who like your Henry Kissingers of the world or your Rupert Murdochs, and these are the kind of people that have attended this. I know that Angela Merkel, for instance, came to power soon after she attended one of the Bilderberg meetings. I also dug up the fact that I think Margaret Thatcher attended it while she was in power, or certainly at some time around that. So some very heavy-hitting characters. Bill Clinton is definitely another character you can include. It does seem as though
Blair.
the same
Tony
Blair, that's one. Another one. Yeah. So, clearly it has extraordinary pull and influence. And I know that Pompeo turned up at last year's gathering as well. Mike Pompeo, the American, the infamous American chap who's kind of thrown himself across West Asia like a plague, to many would say. Maulana, your take, and because part of our program is also looking at the sacrifice given by men of morality, often men who are religious. And Tony also brought this issue of religion and the hijacking of religion and false messiahs, if you like. Well, of course, we're all too familiar with the resistance axis and the movement in the Middle East, which is on the front line, battling Western imperialism, no doubt has some connections to this Bilderberg phenomena, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, I want to explore with you, for instance, first of all, the condolences on the occasion of the martyrdom of Shahid Arif Hussain Hussaini in Pakistan, a leader who was rising up against the immoral orders that existed in that part of the world as well, and emulating in many ways what Ayatollah Khomeini did in Iran against the Shah, another despot. So here we have on the one side a set of rulers, Maulana, who seem to have no morality. On the other, we have the likes of your Che Guevaras, we have the likes of Fidel Castro, with a sort of a loose Christian liberation theology based on a morality of an Abrahamic kind. And of course, you have the likes of Ayatollah Khomeini and Arif al-Husseini, who carried also the banner of morality from the Islamic world, and arguably many still do. What are your thoughts on what Tony's revealed here, the kind of revelations he's brought forward from your perspective? Maulana Razavi, can you hear us? It's possible that we may have lost the connection. We've had a pretty poor connection with Maulana. I'll give Maulana one more chance. Are you with us? Okay. Back to you, Tony. It sounds like we've lost Maulana, but he'll presumably come back shortly. But let's continue this investigation of yours. I mean, the thing is, of course, the minute you talk about organized movements that control the world and planets, it's beyond most people's kind of perception. The immediate gut reaction of people is, oh, it can't be that controlled. We can't possibly have a small cabal running the world or trying to. Is it even possible to provide evidence that they are involved in this kind of agenda?
Okay, well, look, first of all, they would very much like to control the world. They certainly do not control the world. NATO is not quite in charge yet. And but I can tell you, most of the money in the Western world is controlled by them. And are major ways behind much of what's been going on in the Middle East, I think is fair to say. Things like the assassination of Sheikh Yassin. These are things which are part of the Anglo-Zionist Empire's aims. They want to demoralize Islam, and also they want to drive many Muslims into the hands of these fake NATO versions of Islam. So, this is all very much, isn't it, reminiscent of the Knights Templar from the Crusades in medieval times, where we had a whole bunch of people who basically went slaughtering their way around over waves and waves of crusades. And you know what? Funnily enough, there was a lot of this so-called war on terror was started by the deception of the September the 11th attacks. The idea that this was done by bin Laden from a cave in Afghanistan, I think, is now really beyond a joke. No one thinks that. This is probably an
Sure.
operation carried out by the Israeli secret services in conjunction with moles and people who are disloyal within the United States too. So, but the funny thing is, back in the old Crusades, there was a similar something called the Letter of Prester John, which was issued by the Vatican, which conned loads of people in Europe into thinking, oh gosh, we've got to go and fight over in the Holy Land because there's this king that's there fighting on the other side. So what we've got with 9/11, in a way, is a kind of modern equivalent of this medieval fraud by the Vatican in order to try and get people to get in behind this attack on the Middle East. In a way, it's a sort of second attempt to do it, where they failed back in the old days and actually ended up, being quite successful in boosting the cachet of Islam, because these people pretending to be Christians, of course, they were based on the Western Church from Rome, and ended up surrounding the Eastern Church, the Orthodox headquarters, Constantinople, sacking Constantinople and trying to destroy the Orthodox Church. So they weren't Christians at all. They were creating rivers of blood amongst their own believers. And I think it's pretty obvious that there is a connection between this fake Christianity that the Templars represent. And by the way, I'm speaking to you from Bristol, which is an old Templar port. Back in medieval times, we had the Templar ships with their big red Maltese crosses on here. So that's, I think, what we're dealing with today is quite a sophisticated effort, actually, in order to con people, a rather big con, in order to try and persuade people that there is a point in trying to take over the Middle East. Ultimately, I think there will be some kind of conflict between the Zionist entity and there are many Christians that support the Zionist cause. They've been caught. There are also some Jews. Most Jews I meet actually are getting more and more skeptical by the day, by the way, about what's going on in Israel. They're looking at particularly things like the Nation State Act and saying towards our faith, not targeting them with racist attacks. And many Jews are, I think, are starting to step back from their Judaism and maybe even are beginning to step back towards their Judaism and say, well, what Netanyahu and what the Israeli state represents is nothing to do with us and our faith.
Some fascinating stuff. And I'm interested in the fact that you bring up Jewish extremism. I mean, we're almost scared to even say that word. You can say Muslim extremism, you can say Christian extremism, but these days you have to be careful even if you use the word Jewish extremism, because you can be slammed with anti-Semitism. But the Zionist label, of course, at the moment is still very distinct from being a Jew. A Jew or a Zionist are not necessarily the same thing. You can be a Zionist and be a Christian. You can be a Zionist and be a Muslim. You can be a Zionist technically and be an atheist or whatever. So those distinctions were there. But you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn, who obviously wouldn't have been the kind of person ratified by the Bilderberg meeting, I imagine, because he was a bit too nice a guy and a bit too moral. And he obviously has been taken down by a huge Jewish extremist lobby, I would argue. They would allege that he was an anti-Semite and they were clearing anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. But we need to really discuss this as well, because the connections to the Zionists and money and power, of course, immediately when you say that, they jump at you and say, oh, right, now here we go, the tropes about Jews being rich and whatnot. But, look, when you talk about Kissinger and when you talk about many of these folk who are in the echelons of power, they are either, it seems very openly, what I'd call extreme Jews, i.e. Zionists, or they're either hiding the fact. But if you start looking and researching and seeing, you often see a lot of these families, the Rothschilds, obviously the premier among them, the likes of many others you could name. I think there's a lot of what we call in certain circles, taqiyya. In Islam, there is a point where you're allowed to hide your identity if your life is in danger. Now, I could easily argue that the Jews after the Holocaust, even prior to that, being persecuted, genuinely so, across Europe and some other parts of the world, may well have done what we describe as taqiyya and hidden their identity. There are many who probably don't even know that they were. They've kind of maybe converted. Now, I'm not going to pick on the Jews because there are nasty people in all religions and all non-religious based societies, but we need to not have an exceptionalism to the Jewish extremism, because that seems to be the one which everybody wants to fob us away from. And the likes of Kissinger and their known links to Zionism, their promotion of Holocausts around the world. I mean, you only have to look at Cambodia as one example for Kissinger. I mean, like if you know the history of what they did in Cambodia, you'd want to annihilate Kissinger there and then. But this connection, I mean, should we be scared of making this connection between Jewish extremism, Bilderbergs, and globalism of the immoral kind? Tony, are you still with us? I hope I haven't lost both of you. Maulana, are you with us, or Tony?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, very good, Maulana. So that one I'm going to fire over at you. This idea of Islamic extremism is very fashionable amongst the mainstream media. Nobody talks about Jewish extremism, yet the Bilderbergs seem to have an awful lot of these fellows also as part of their kind of establishment. Should we get the Jewish community to start considering the extremism that exists within their communities?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt if we pick up the Bible and Torah. I mean, I was discussing this subject in one of the TV channels, and I was being criticized that Quran is full of this and that. I said, why you're criticizing Quran? Why don't you pick up Bible and Torah and see what's in there? Does that mean that we should ban all the holy books and divine scripture? Of course not. I mean, we should study and research and identify what are the verses, what were the incidents, and how to implement the Islamic Sharia. As far as Islam is concerned, Islamic Sharia can be only implemented when you have a just ruler. If you don't have a just ruler, then it will be kind of Islamic Sharia would be abused. And this is exactly what these anti-Muslim power Zionists are trying to do. They want to use the word of truth and abuse it in favor of themselves. And there is a tradition, there is a saying in Arabic, kalimatu haqqin yuradu bihal batil. They pretend to be promoting the Muslim youth. They pretend to be the supporters of Islam. They come in the middle of youth who are suffering from identity crisis, especially in the Western countries, and then they use the kalimatul haq, the word of truth, and abuse it and misguide and mislead the youngsters and youth. And similar thing is happening in the Christianity and Judaism. They are nurturing and training the youth to be against each other, which is although again in that case they are using the words like one world order. Islam is not against one world order, but who is the person who is prescribing the one world order? That is important. If the moral values are not behind that, if the ethical values are not behind that, if the one world order is only to fill the pocket already millionaires and billionaires who are ruling the world, then that one world order is not useful, it's not beneficial for the humanity. What is beneficial for the humanity is that we should develop an order which respects all values and morals and bring peace and in the society and get rid of discrimination And certainly, if we keep following Zionists' ideology, we will not be able to bring that kind of peace and justice. And that's why there are a group of Jewish people who are against Zionists as well within the Jewish community, because they know that they are going against the teachings of Moses and teachings of the divine scripture.
Well, the Natura Carta have appeared on this show before, and you're absolutely right. Tony, are you still with us?
Yep, I certainly am. And if you can hear me.
That's yes. Now we can hear you. Just a response to Maulana Razavi. He's agreeing with you, really, in the sense that unless we know the morality and the moral values of those who are trying to shape our world, as humanity, we're in serious trouble. I mean, the argument would be, we now have more knowledge, robotic engineering, everything from, stem cell manufacturing, and there's all these kind of weapons of different grades that are emerging. Nanotechnology is there. This world of science has opened up more knowledge and more power potentially for these kind of fellows. Now, if the likes of Kissinger and the Bilderberg fraternity have access to most of that power, that knowledge, and the wealth to be able to exploit it, are we not in really serious trouble, even more trouble than we've been in the past?
I think we are, yes. I think we're in extreme trouble since like that. But what they're effectively doing is they're buying up our world. They have, for example, just with this pandemic that we've recently, and by the way, here in Britain, it's pretty much gone. I mean, if you look at the statistics, the death statistics are virtually zero. And yet, at the time the pandemic is finishing, suddenly everybody's got to wear masks. There's a certain absurdity to the way the government policy is going here. And I think that's all part of the demoralization of the public. We're being told to do things which don't make any sense. And a lot of people are doing them. The idea is here that you've got the misrule in charge. So what the Bilderbergers, the banksters behind them, because obviously all this is bankrolled and financed by big banks like HSBC, they're regularly at Bilderberg. Bank was founded in Hong Kong, and it was founded on the drugs trade. It was founded on the opium trade. These are the people who are bankrolling these Bilderberg firms and arms firms, etc. And these people stand to make a lot of money from war, as we've seen in Yemen, for example. Tens of billions of pounds being spent by the Saudis on weapons to kill and destroy people in the poorest country in the whole of the Middle East. Unbelievable, really. But this is allowed to go on because of the
Tony,
enormous...
So Tony, I'd like to ask you something supplementary to that. I'd like to just jump in there for you to ask you, the ordinary person, now that you've revealed this kind of this reality of a sort of a group that wants to influence and almost engineer the direction the world goes in, and then they have this extraordinary power. Now, how do ordinary folk respond to that? Most people, Joe Public is struggling for keeping his roof over his head and having his mortgage paid off, even here in the West, which is supposed to be really affluent, let alone those parts of the world where people are destitute, hungry, and poverty-stricken or war-ridden. You see, even here, people are scared of that power. And they'll say, oh, well, whatever they're doing, it's got nothing to do with me. What can I do about it anyway? And apart from, moan and groan, there's not much I can do to challenge them. What would you recommend we do once you have this information that there is this nefarious group? What's our duty? What's our obligation as ordinary folk on the ground?
Well, look, I would say, first of all, it's very important that we do understand what's happening, because if you look at the voting record over the last 30 years in Britain, apart from the Brexit vote, the referendum vote, the voting figures have gone down and down and down, and so people are disillusioned. Most ordinary people understand that the system is rigged. Whichever way they vote, things are still getting worse for them. That they have less money in their pocket to spend, their freedoms are decreasing. So there is this sense, I suppose you could describe it as a kind of angst, where there's a kind of unknown dread. We know something's wrong, but we're not quite sure what it is. Actually, a close look at the companies involved in these Bilderberg conferences, the chairmen of these groups, the connections with the military, with NATO, with starting wars and profiting from wars. It helps people understand in their own minds who and what it is we're actually dealing with. And I think if you, in your own mind, you're trying to fight your own small battle to make sense of the world, to make a living, it really helps to understand who it is you're up against, which kind of
Sure.
influences in the world it's up against. And in fact, I've personally spoken to many people who've been working in institutions which they didn't really believe in, who they've had a sort of an awakening, really, saying, well, actually, I'm realizing now all I'm doing in my job day to day is feeding the whims of the rich. And I don't actually want to do that anymore. And they prepare, maybe over 6 months, maybe over a year, to make a life change of some sort in order to what you might call disconnect from Babylon. In other words, unplug
Okay.
themselves from the system. And I think that's
Look,
absolutely viable. So long as you've got plans about what to do, maybe it's going off grid, maybe it's a form of career change, maybe it's selling your house and living in some other way, even emigrating, but some sort of change so you no longer feel that you yourself are
brilliant.
contributing to propping up this effectively it's evil system. Because these people who are rich and powerful, wealthy, the Bilderbergers, what happens is if there's any opposition to them, whether that's democratic opposition through parliament, or whether that's media opposition through exposure, through the mass media, all they do is they buy it up and they close it down, or they just take it over, they sack the journalists, they get rid of the MPs, whoever it is that's in the way. And, I think ultimately they're on a hiding to nothing with this, actually, because believe their own propaganda, and more people are waking up and not believing what they see on TV, not believing the news, and understanding that actually there is something to all this conspiracy theory stuff. That maybe it's not just the moon landings, that didn't happen. Maybe it's actually
Yeah.
something real to this, and that there's a lot of literature out there. One I would
Okay, Tony.
recommend
Well,
thoroughly. It's
sure,
called a
sure.
book called Secrets and Lies by David Southwell, which is almost like a gazetteer of conspiracy theories. David's a lovely guy. He's based in London, a writer based in London. He's a kind of agent for the community, and he'll go in and he'll expose these things. I think it's a question of just saying no. Once you understand who
Okay.
really rules you, then you can start to make decisions for the rest of your life.
Thank you very much, Tony. Well, we've only got a few minutes left. Maulana, I'm going to come to you because we've talked about the problem and Tony's given us some solutions on a practical level as well, very, very succinctly there. We started also with the notion of martyrdom. You see, the ultimate sacrifice somebody can make towards tackling injustice and corruption is martyrdom. And Shahid Arif al-Husseini is just one great figure within the Islamic tradition, the contemporary Islamic tradition that we can point to. Just give us an indication. Of course, not everybody is required to martyr themselves, but certainly just give me a little background about his contribution to tackling these kind of immoral world orders.
Well, as soon as the Islamic Revolution took place in Iran, Shahid Arif Husseini had moved to Pakistan. He was studying in Jose al-Miqam. While he was there, we used to be very to each other and met each other. And then he decided to move to Pakistan and took over the leadership of the Muslim Ummah. And he supported the revolution that was established by Imam Khomeini rahmatullah alayh. But the enemies didn't like. They didn't like to see a neighboring country following the footsteps of Islamic revolution in Iran, and therefore they assassinated him. And he was not afraid to be assassinated. And this is what happens when your aims and goals are high and you are willing to establish peace and justice in the society at the cost of your life. And if you reach to that kind of sacrifice, that is called martyrdom, and that is not encouraged, but not discouraged as well. If a person reaches to that level of decision and he decides to do this great sacrifice, doesn't have to be of life. You could do sacrifice of your wealth and knowledge and time and efforts and whatever you could imagine. But one of the Sayyid Arif Hussaini did not deliberately put himself into the field of being killed, but the enemies, they could not tolerate him. And this
Okay.
is
Well,
the story of all our imams, all our infallible leaders. None of them died with a natural death because the enemy could not tolerate their message of peace and justice.
thank you, Maulana. Sadly, we've run out of time. I'm going to redo this analysis of Shaheed Arif al-Husseini again with you at some stage very soon, because there was far more to talk about. But I defer to Tony because his narrative was absolutely riveting. Thank you, Tony Gosling, for joining us, and we'd love to have you back, because I don't think we really even touched on the tip of the iceberg in terms of the narratives you have. And I'd love to invite you back for more fascinating discussions. And thank you, Maulana, for your patience as well. Our sound cut you out
Thank you.
earlier on today. I apologize for that. And join us again for the next edition of Critical Eye.